The government is expected to announce whether any funds are to be diverted from any department towards resolving the power crisis. Cabinet approved the newly gazetted regulations governing the national state of disaster and energy. Let's chat with an energy expert ahead of the briefing by Minister in the Presidency, Mondli Gungubela. We're hoping he'll give specifics on the implementation of the energy state of disaster. Mr. Trollip, good morning and thank you very much for your time. So today we expect greater detail on the measures put in place to address the electricity crisis, in the main being the state of disaster regulations. What, firstly, are your views on just the regulations?
So, good morning, Mfundo. I've read through the regulations. There are about 6 pages of them. In general, I'm somewhat comforted by the fact that they very specifically, in fact, refer to measures necessary, some measures necessary, not all, to deal with the disaster. So when this announcement was first made, I was a bit worried that the measures would be too broad and that they wouldn't be specific. So in general, that looks good. There are, and now the thing is, unfortunately, these days when government says things, instead of wanting to trust them and make them work, we immediately are skeptical because of all the things that have happened, all the controversy, the contradictory statements, the broken promises, the corruption, the breaking of the law, etc. So the following comments I make have got to do with that. Firstly,
so you're saying, okay, you can continue.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're saying
firstly,
that...
Yeah.
Apologies. Continue.
Okay, so in general, they do restrict most of the regulations to what's necessary. It doesn't include everything, but they're largely restricted to what's necessary. But there are some broad powers, and I'm always worried about laws which give what seem like blank checks to government. I'm going to read the first one, which is very worrying. It says, so a lot of the regulations say these will only be done while there's load shedding, when it's necessary, while the state of disaster happens. But then there's this statement. It says an activity which is permitted by an authorization or exemption granted in terms of the regulations or directions issued during the national state of disaster remains lawful notwithstanding the termination of the national state of disaster. This kind of regulation seems to me to just attempt in the future to undo many of the laws that we have put in place to safeguard the rights of citizens, the environment, public finances, etc., etc. So that's a bit of a big blank check. Secondly, the regulations don't state a termination date. I'm not saying that we know when load shedding could be ended, but they could say these regulations stay in effect until X and X and X date, say 2 years from now, at which stage, to continue with them, they need to be reviewed and reissued. Instead of that, there's nothing. So there's a kind of crazy disincentive here that so long as there's load shedding and so long as we have these regulations, there's a whole lot of exemptions given to government. So if a government wants to continue with these exemptions, it just leaves these regulations in place, which undo a lot of the laws so carefully put in place by our democracy. So those are 2 overall big worries that I have. And then I have a specific worry with they name the National Environmental Management Act as that some things will be exempt from that. And I have a real worry there that could be abused. So I think that could be put much more precisely. And under which circumstances could NEMA, that's the Environmental Management Act, be exempted, not just a broad exemption. So those, on the whole, fairly good, but some massive loopholes. And, I like there's a saying, they say, once you open the door and let some monsters into a room, it's very hard to get them out. And specifically that one that says these exemptions will remain in place after these regulations, disaster regulations, are terminated is particularly worrying.
Now, still on exemptions, but particularly the institutions that want to be exempted from load shedding, it sounded like a legitimate demand, but is there capacity to action this? Because even with Andre de Ruyter in his answering affidavit on that court action brought by UDM and others, he stated that those exemptions could possibly destabilize the network. So is this honestly going to be something that can be actioned, or we could possibly see then a national blackout?
So, Mfundo, that particular regulation states that it may be done only if it doesn't have the specific effect that Andre de Ruyter mentioned. So that's the first thing. The regulation doesn't just give a blanket. It doesn't just say all hospitals or all, however much we'd like that. And then the second answer to that question is, in many cases, it's a huge technical problem because hospitals or other key infrastructure, which they list all the key infrastructure, could be part of a circuit which also includes a shopping center or a whole lot of houses or whatever, or a factory. So that would mean rewiring and rerouting, putting in new transformers. So in some cases, it makes a lot of sense. In other cases, it would be technically very difficult. Also for some of our municipalities that are already technically challenged with staff and really infrastructure in a bad state. So, but I think the regulation does make provision for treating each one on a case-by-case basis.
But for those who haven't been granular and gone through the regulations, it seems that in society there is that expectation that if we've now declared a state of disaster, it means those institutions will be exempted. Meaning then it's more important today that we're having the kind of briefing that we're going to have to just give greater detail on what these regulations actually mean to manage expectations, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, Mfundo. I think that communication, but also open and honest communication now is crucial to, firstly, just to get government and public on the same side, because, you know, there's an adversarial situation now, which, you know, at the beginning of this interview, I said government has to take a lot of responsibility for, because there have been contradictory statements, not only between, for example, the Eskom CEO in that interview and government, but between government ministers, between different parts of government. And we really need government now to get its act together in terms of coherent policy. And that is, and I'm known to say this often, this is particularly difficult because inside the ANC, there are actually different, strong positions taken both on the causes of load shedding and the solutions. So I think government has to now not be the ANC. It has to realize it's government. And despite the fact that there are big problems inside the currently ruling party, that government must professionally take charge. And I just want to, you know, I'm not an agent of either government or anti-government or any company and whatever. I'm absolutely independent. I have to say, I was very heartened. I listened to the government communication and information system briefing on Friday afternoon. And the people that are really shining there now is Treasury. Treasury are really coming to the problem. They're coming with coherent policies, progressive policies, and they're taking charge. And it's nice to see that. And I think basically what's happening is the Operation Vulindlela, run by Treasury inside the presidency, is not papering over, but dealing with the big differences of opinion between the various government departments.
We've seen a lot of progress through Operation Vulindlela. But I want to take you back to just your plea for there to not be the age-old problem of conflation of party and state, that the government now needs to take charge. But these are political deployees. So ideally it would be great, but one would assume that it's never very easy for them not to manage the political fallout that could take place, because you talk of there being differences around the causes of load shedding and how to even resolve the issue right now. Is it really as simple as let's focus, we are in government? Because most of them always have to take care of home, or at least manage the political expectations coming from the party that has deployed them.
So I think this is the first big test of our now 30-year-old democracy. I think that the state, the conflation, the overlap between party and state is at the center of a lot of this. And we're really going to have to start putting South Africa first, start putting government first. And unfortunately, the history is such. I can see the problem of people in a particular party like the ANC. They want to stay in power first, because that's what political parties do. But unfortunately, that combined with this, you cannot have a political party deciding on who works at many levels of government and putting their people there and hope to actually have a separation between party and state. And the separation of powers and the separation of party and state is at the center of our the design of our democracy. And unless we want to become a China or a Russia or a North Korea or whatever, if we wanted an operational democracy, we have to now separate out government and party. And it's a difficult thing to do. It's difficult to separate the executive from the judiciary. You know, these are hundreds of years has been put into putting these democratic, the successful democracies in place. And often they fall because of this very reason. So that's what we really have to do now. And I think maybe we can look upon the load shedding as the first huge test for our democracy to now say, okay, government, you can't continue arguing amongst yourselves and solve this problem. We need one story. And that's where the president has to step in.
Speaking of the president, do you think perhaps with his decision to establish an electricity ministry that he has decided to draw that line? Because the party position was that Eskom was to be moved to DMRE, but then now he decided to establish an exclusive ministry or portfolio to deal with electricity. Would you say that was the first salvo, that here we're seeing a desire to distinguish government from the political party, that not all the views held by the political party will find expression or be implemented in government?
So I think it could go either way. It could just be some fancy footwork for him to remove electricity away from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, which in my view, and I've been very frank, and I've studied this for 30 years. Well, yes, for 30 years, I've studied it all the time. It's been a central problem, the differences between the Mineral Resources and Energy Minister and Treasury and the President. They on record, as you know, the Gwede Mantashe is saying the President twisted his arm to, in fact, exempt people from the very regulations which is now leading to this huge planned private sector participation in energy generation, which might be a big part of saving the day. We have to remember, President Ramaphosa twisted Gwede Mantashe's arm to achieve that. And as recent as February, Gwede Mantashe was saying, see, the private sector aren't coming. Now we've got a reported 20 gigawatts of private sector power coming onto the grid. So back to your question, I think it depends on that minister, firstly. And I'm on record. I think you interviewed me. Well, ENCA did.
Yes, Mr.
I said,
Trollip.
If that minister is junior in the ANC, really junior, to Gwede Mantashe, then it's going to be hard because, you know, the real power stuff, politics happens, you know, in the ANC formations in their institutions. So if that minister can't tell Gwede Mantashe no, or a yes to things which Gwede Mantashe doesn't want, then there's trouble. If that's a powerful minister and he gets the backing of the president, like daily backing, then maybe we're going somewhere. So let's see who that minister is. Let's see when that minister comes in, how which plans he lines up behind.
And then just in closing, I want to take you to the emergency procurement procedures and those regulations. It's the ones that everybody would be focused on, of course. It states that the procedure is subject to, of course, the PFMA, Municipal Finance Management Act. We also heard the Auditor General will also conduct the real-time audits, and the procurement will also be published and reported to Parliament on the month of expenditure. Do you believe these measures will safeguard the public purse?
So up until now, and I've been involved in this, the PFMA and the Municipal MFMA, and also the PAJA, the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, and PIA, there's the Information Act. Usually they only come into play if somebody, a party has a problem and challenges a government decision.
Mr. Trollip, let's hope this time everybody understands that this is our chance as a country to get things right. Thank you very much, though, for your time this morning. That was energy expert Hilton Trollip. He's a research fellow at the Global Risk Governance Program at UC.